The billionaire had everything money could buy, except for the one thing that could stop his triplets from screaming. As the crowd watched him fail, a girl in rags stepped out of the shadows with a secret that would change both their lives forever. The afternoon was overcast, and the riverside estate sprawled across 200 acres of pristine countryside, yet the air was pierced by the jagged, rhythmic wailing of 3 toddlers. 40 yards away, partially hidden behind the massive trunk of an ancient oak tree, Julian Riverside stood in a charcoal gray suit, his posture rigid, and his dark hair perfectly styled. He was the owner of an empire worth billions, but right now he was playing a cold, calculating game. He had ordered his nanny to leave his 2-year-old sons, Marcus, Lucas, and their brother on the dirt path, and walk away. It was a test of loyalty and humanity. He wanted to see if his well-paid staff actually cared for his children, or if they were merely collecting a paycheck. As the minutes ticked by, the twins' crying intensified, their small faces turning red as they sat on the dirt path, holding hands. A gardener walked past and ignored them. The estate manager drove by in a golf cart and didn't even slow down. Julian made mental notes of their indifference, his heart hardening with every second his sons were left to suffer. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the road. It was a girl, perhaps 13 or 14, with dark skin and dreadlocked hair that stood out in every direction. She wore a torn, frayed brown jacket over a dirt-smudged shirt, and blue jeans that were far too large for her thin frame. Her shoes were a mismatched pair, falling apart at the seams. She was a street kid, a trespasser on private property. Yet she was the only one who stopped. The girl, whose name was Ira, tilted her head as if listening to the frequency of their pain, and then she moved with purpose. She didn't hesitate or look for a superior's permission. She dropped to her knees on the dirt road directly in front of the distraught toddlers. Julian watched from his hiding spot, his muscles tensed, ready to intervene if she posed a threat. But what he saw instead was a miracle of empathy. Ira moved with a gentle, slow grace, letting the boys see her hands so they wouldn't be startled. She reached out and took their small, trembling hands in hers. Marcus and Lucas, sensing a calm authority they hadn't felt all afternoon, reached back and gripped her fingers. Ira began to speak in a low, melodic tone, a soothing rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the air. Within seconds, the screaming stopped. The world of the Riverside estate went silent, save for the rustle of the oak leaves and the girl's soft voice. The triplets' crying subsided into tiny hiccups, and then into nothing at all. They leaned toward her, their terror replaced by a sudden intense fascination. Ira began to move her fingers, casting shadow puppets against the light of the overcast sky. One of the boys let out a small, unmistakable giggle, then the others followed. The trauma of being abandoned on a lonely road faded instantly as they watched the girl in the torn jacket. Julian Riverside stepped out from behind the oak tree, his formal suit looking out of place against the raw, honest scene on the ground. As he approached, Ira's body language shifted immediately. She became protective, positioning herself between the man and the children she had just comforted. She didn't know he was a billionaire. She only saw a man who had let children cry. In that moment of triple silence, the girl with nothing had become the most powerful person on the estate, proving that the poorest person is often the only one who knows what love truly looks like. The sun hung low over the Riverside estate, casting long amber shadows that acted as a border between 2 worlds that were never meant to touch. On one side of the high wooden post and rail fences lay a kingdom of gold and glass. The main house loomed in the distance, a sprawling mansion of white columns and manicured gardens that looked more like a silent museum than a place where people actually lived. Every blade of grass was trimmed to a precise 3 inches, and the air smelled of expensive pine and ancient oak tree. This was the world of Julian Riverside, a man who wore a charcoal gray suit even on his own property. A man whose manufacturing empire was worth billions, and whose life was governed by the same rigid control he used to style his hair. Inside those walls, silence was a luxury bought with money, and every need was anticipated by a staff that moved like ghosts. But as the estate's pristine dirt road wound toward the far edges of the property, the gold began to fade into dust. Beyond the perimeter, where the rolling green pastures ended, lay the shanty town, a collection of leaning shacks and narrow alleys where the air smelled of wood smoke and struggle. This was where Ira lived, in a world where the only thing that grew in abundance was the grit under one's fingernails. Her home was not a museum. It was a sanctuary of survival made of scrap wood and hope. While Julian counted his billions, Ira counted the days since she had last felt the warmth of her mother's hand, a loss that had left her alone on the streets for 8 long months. Ira's daily life was a masterclass in making something out of nothing. She wore a brown jacket that was torn and frayed, jeans that were far too large for her thin frame, and shoes that didn't match, one a dull brown, the other a shade darker, both held together by sheer weight. To the people inside the Riverside gates, she was a shadow, a street kid who was probably trespassing on private property. They saw her tangled dreadlocks and dirt-smudged face and looked away, fearful that her poverty might be contagious. They did not see the wisdom in her eyes that had seen too much for a 13-year-old, or the rhythmic humming she used to keep the cold at bay. The contrast was staggering. In Julian's world, a broken car or a crying child was a problem to be solved by firing a staff member or conducting a cold-hearted test. In Ira's world, a crying child was a call to action that required no paycheck. Julian's life was defined by what he could command. Ira's life was defined by what she could give, when she had nothing left. As she walked the dusty path bordering the billionaire's land, her mismatched shoes clicking against the hard earth, she was moving toward a collision of these two worlds. The dust of the shacks was about to settle on the gold of the estate, and for the first time in his life, the man who owned everything was about to meet someone who possessed the only thing he lacked, a heart that didn't need to be tested. The overcast afternoon hung heavy over the Riverside estate, the air thick with a tension that only Julian Riverside could have manufactured. He stood motionless behind the trunk of a massive, centuries-old oak tree, his charcoal gray suit blending into the deep shadows of the bar. From this hidden vantage point he had a clear view of the dirt road that wound like a ribbon through his 200 acres of pristine countryside. Julian was a man who believed that everything in life, business, family and loyalty, could be measured and tested with the right set of variables. Today the variables were his own children. 20 yards ahead of him, sitting directly on the well-maintained dirt path, were Marcus and Luca. They were barely 2 years old, looking like miniature porcelain dolls in their matching white long-sleeved shirts, brown and white striped overalls, and tan straw hats. Their nanny, Miss Patterson, had followed Julian's ironclad instructions to the letter. She had placed them there, told them she would be right back, and walked toward the barn without looking back. Now the toddlers were alone, their small hands gripping each other as the realization of their abandonment set in. The crying began as a soft whimper, a confused sound that vibrated through the quiet air of the estate. Julian watched, his jaw set and his eyes narrowed. To an outsider, this was a scene of inexplicable cruelty, but to Julian it was a necessary audit of his manufacturing empire's human asset. He needed to know if the people he paid thousands of dollars to were actually invested in the safety of his legacy, or if they were merely going through the motions until the clock hit 5. He felt a sharp pang of guilt as the whimpers escalated into jagged, frantic screams, but he suppressed it with the cold logic of a CEO. The first subject of his test appeared 3 minutes into the ordeal. The estate's gardener walked past the tool shed, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was less than 15 feet from the boys. He stopped, his gaze falling on the red-faced toddlers who were now shaking with fear. Julian held his breath, waiting for the man to drop his shears and rush to comfort them. Instead, the gardener merely wiped sweat from his brow, glanced toward the main house to see if anyone was watching, and continued walking toward the shed. Julian's hand tightened into a fist in his pocket. The man would be terminated by sunset. 2 minutes later, the estate manager drove by in a motorized golf cart. The electric hum of the vehicle should have been a herald of rescue. The manager saw the twins, his eyes lingering on the straw hats, bobbing as they sobbed.
Yet he didn't even tap the brake. He continued toward the main house, his mind clearly on his own schedule rather than the two terrified children left in the dust. Julian made another mental note, his heart hardening further. He had built a museum of a home, filled it with the finest things money could buy, and populated it with people who were as cold and hollow as the marble statues in his foyer. The twins' crying had reached a fever pitch, a raw and desperate sound that seemed to echo off the wooden rail fencing. They were scared, confused, and clutching one another for the only comfort available in a world that had suddenly turned indifferent. Julian remained behind the tree, his rigid posture a mask for the growing realization that his wealth had bought him everything except genuine care. He was surrounded by beauty and order, yet as he watched his son's distress go ignored by those he trusted, he had never felt more bankrupt. The test was proving successful, but the results were a bitter pill to swallow. He waited, hoping for a shred of humanity to emerge from the sprawling green pastures, unaware that the answer to his test was currently approaching from the far end of the road in the form of a girl with nothing to her name. The raw, jagged wailing of the triplets had become a physical weight in the air, a sound so desperate it seemed to rattle the pristine wooden fences of the riverside estate. Marcus and Lucas were no longer just crying, they were hyperventilating, their small bodies shaking with a primal fear of the void that had opened when their world turned silent and empty. From his hidden post behind the oak, Julian felt the cold sweat of regret prickling his skin. He was seconds away from breaking his own rules and stepping out to end the experiment, but then the atmosphere shifted. A shadow fell across the dirt road, soft and elongated. Ira had arrived. She didn't run, and she didn't scream for help. She moved with the quiet, rhythmic grace of someone who lived by the cycles of the sun rather than the ticking of a Swiss watch. As she approached the three toddlers, she slowed her pace, sensing the fragility of the moment. She was a vision of poverty, mismatched shoes, a coat held together by threads, and hair that defied every standard of Julian's curated world. But as she knelt in the dust, she possessed an air of royalty that no amount of old money could purchase. She didn't reach out to grab them. Instead, she sat cross-legged in the dirt, placing herself at their eye level. She began to hum. It wasn't a song Julian recognized. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from deep within her chest, a sound that mimicked the steady thrum of a heartbeat. It was a melody passed down through generations of women who had nothing but their voices to comfort their children in the dark. The effect was almost instantaneous. The sharp, high-pitched peaks of the toddlers' screams began to round off into softer sobs. They turned their tear-streaked faces toward her, mesmerized by the strange, beautiful girl who looked like the earth itself. Ira then raised her hands. In the filtered, overcast light, her slender fingers began to dance. She wasn't just moving them, she was weaving a story. With a deft flick of her wrists, she created the silhouette of a bird taking flight against the backdrop of her own brown jacket. She made a rabbit hop across the knees of her oversized jeans. She was creating a world of shadow and light in the middle of a dusty road. The triplets watched, their breaths hitching in their chests, the terror of the last 10 minutes dissolving into wonder. Lucas was the first to reach out, his small hand tentatively touching Ira's finger as she made a shadow butterfly flutter near his neck. Then came the miracle Julian hadn't expected. A laugh. It was a small bubbly sound from Marcus, followed quickly by a giggle from Lucas. The triplets were no longer victims of a cruel social experiment. They were children again, captivated by the simplest of magic. Ira leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper as she spoke to them in a language of kindness that required no translation. She wiped a smudge of dirt from Marcus's cheek with the hem of her frayed sleeve, her touch so light it was as if she were handling gossip. Watching from the shadows, Julian felt a profound sense of shame wash over him. He had designed a test to find care, and he had found it not in the hearts of the professionals he paid to provide it, but in a girl who had every reason to walk past and resent his wealth. She gave the gift of peace, not because it was her job, but because she couldn't bear to see another soul feel the weight of being forgotten. In that moment, the dust of the road was more precious than the gold in his vaults, and the girl with the mismatched shoes had become the only person on the 200-acre estate who truly knew what it meant to be rich. Julian Riverside stepped out from the shroud of the oak tree, the dry grass crunching beneath his polished leather shoes. The sound was a sharp intrusion into the fragile peace Ira had built. As he approached, the girl's posture changed instantly. She didn't shrink away or beg for mercy for trespassing. Instead, she rose to her feet with a fluid, defensive grace, positioning her thin frame like a shield between Julian and the triplets. Her dark eyes, which had been soft and melodic moments ago, sharpened into flints of steel. She looked at his charcoal suit, his perfectly styled hair, and the cold authority radiating from his gaze. And she didn't see a master. She saw a threat. "It's okay," Julian called out, his voice modulated and calm, the tone he used to settle nervous shareholders. "I'm their father." The tension in Ira's shoulders didn't dissipate. It curdled into something hotter. She looked down at the triplets, who were still sitting in the dirt, their faces stained with tear tracks and dust, and then back at the man who claimed them. "You're their father," she repeated, her voice trembling not with fear but with a rising indignant heat. "Then why are they sitting alone on a dirt road crying? Where is their mother? Where is anyone watching?" Julian reached them and stopped, finally seeing up close the true extent of the girl's poverty. The frayed collar of her brown jacket, the dirt under her fingernails, and the mismatched shoes that were more holes than leather. Yet he felt an unexpected flicker of shame under her scrutiny. "That's complicated," he began, straightening his cuffs. "I was conducting a test of my staff. I needed to see who would stop to help them, who actually cared enough to break their routine." Ira stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign, nonsensical language. "A test?" she asked, her voice rising. "You used your own children as bait. They're babies." They were terrified. They thought the world had ended because no one was coming. Julian felt the need to defend his logic, the cold, analytical mind that had built a manufacturing empire. "I know it seems harsh, but in my world, you have to know who you can trust. I pay these people a fortune too." "It doesn't seem harsh." "It is harsh," Ira interrupted, stepping fully in front of the boys as Lucas reached out to grab the hem of her oversized jean. She looked at the sprawling mansion in the distance, then back at Julian with a look of profound disgust. "You know what I've learned living on the streets. Rich people have everything except common sense. You have 200 acres of grass, and a house like a museum, but you don't even know how to be a dad without a stopwatch and a spreadsheet." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian Riverside, a man who had silenced boardrooms with a single glance, stood speechless in the middle of his own road. No one had ever spoken to him with such raw, unfiltered honesty. He looked at his sons, who were now calm and safe, not because of his money or his grand plan, but because a girl with nothing had given them a minute of her time. Ira didn't wait for his permission or an apology. She knelt back down and, with a strength that seemed impossible for her thin frame, scooped Marcus and Lucas into her arms, one on each hip. "Where's your house?" she demanded, her jaw tight. "I'm taking them somewhere safe, since you're too busy playing games to do it yourself." Julian watched her start to walk toward the white columns of the mansion, his own children clinging to her neck as if she were the only stable thing in their world. He walked alongside her, feeling the heavy weight of the shame she had diagnosed. He had designed a test to find a heart of gold among his staff, but he had ignored the fact that his own heart had turned to lead in the process. He realized then that the girl was right. He had all the gold in the world, but he had been the poorest man on the estate, until she showed up to teach him what he was missing. The heavy oak doors of the Riverside mansion swung open, revealing a foyer of white marble and crystal chandeliers that shimmered like captive stars. Julian stepped inside, followed closely by Ira, who still carried the weight of the triplets with a defiant, weary strength. The air inside was chilled by central colonial-style cooling, a stark contrast to the humid, dusty heat of the road. As they crossed the threshold, the silence of the house was shattered by the collective gasp of the household staff. Miss Peterson, the nanny, stood paralyzed near a Greek bust, her eyes darting from Julian's grim face to the disheveled girl holding the billionaire's heirs. The estate manager and two housemaids hovered in the periphery, their expressions shifting from confusion to a pointed, elitist disdain, as they took in Ira's mismatched shoes, and the grime on her oversized coat. Julian did not stop to acknowledge their silent judgment. He gestured toward the velvet sofa, and only when Ira felt the toddler's feet touch the expensive fabric did she finally let go. Her arms shook from the exertion, but her eyes remained locked on Julian, waiting for the moment he would remember his status, and cast her back out into the dirt. Instead, Julian turned to his staff, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. that signaled the end of their era of indifference. He informed Mrs. Patterson and the manager that their services were no longer required, citing their failure to act when the children were in distress. The room turned cold with a different kind of tension, as the people who had spent years curating this museum realized that their gold-plated resumes had been rendered worthless by a street girl's instinct. Turning back to Ira, Julian's gaze softened into something resembling genuine curiosity. He saw the way she looked at the mansion, not with greed or awe, but with a guarded suspicion, as if the walls themselves were a trap. He realized then that he couldn't simply hand her a wad of cash and send her back to the shanties. That would be another test he would surely fail. He spoke slowly, making sure every person in the room heard his decree. He offered her a room, one of the 12 empty guest suites upstairs, and a place at the estate, not as a servant but as a ward and a companion to his son. He spoke of tutors, new clothes, and 3 meals a day, promising her an education that would ensure she never had to sleep in a shack again. The shock among the remaining staff was palpable. A maid dropped a silver tray, the clatter echoing against the high ceilings like a gunshot. To them, Ira was a trespasser, a smudge on the pristine surface of the Riverside legacy. But Ira did not jump at the offer. She stood in the center of the marble floor, looking down at Marcus and Lucas, who were already pulling at her frayed sleeves, begging for another shadow puppy. She looked at Julian, her jaw set with the same fierce independence that had helped her survive 8 months alone. She told him clearly that she wasn't staying for the velvet or the gold, but because the boys deserved a protector who didn't need a paycheck to care. Julian nodded, a rare, humble smile touching his lips as he realized he had just invited the most honest person he had ever met to live under his roof. The transition from the dusty road to the polished halls of the Riverside estate was not a seamless glide, but a grueling climb through a landscape of silent judgment. In the months that followed her arrival, Ira found that the marble floors were colder than the dirt paths of the shanty town, and the whispers of the elite were sharper than the winter wind. Julian had kept his word, providing her with a suite that was larger than her entire former neighborhood, and a wardrobe of fine fabrics, but he could not buy the acceptance of the world he inhabited. Ira moved through the mansion like a ghost in silk, her dreadlocks tamed into neat braids, her mismatched shoes replaced by leather loafers that felt like weights on her feet. Her education began with a phalanx of private tutors, men and women, with clipped accents who looked at Ira as if she were a difficult math problem, rather than a child. In the beginning, the gap between her life on the streets and the curriculum of the privileged felt insurmountable. While her peers in the private academies Julian planned for her to attend were discussing classical literature, Ira was still unlearning the survival instinct that told her to hide bread in her pillowcases. The bullying was not loud or physical. It was a curated exclusion. The children of Julian's business associates, who often visited the estate for playdates with the triplets, made sure Ira knew she was an outsider. They spoke over her as if she were part of the furniture, and made snide remarks about her charity case status. They laughed at her accent and the way she still hummed to herself when she was stressed, calling her a street witch behind their hands. But Ira had learned resilience in a school where the tuition was paid in hunger and cold, and she was not so easily broken. She realized quickly that knowledge was the only currency that would truly make her equal to those who looked down on her. While the mansion slept, Ira stayed awake under the glow of a designer desk lamp, devouring books on psychology, history, and biology. She treated her studies with the same fierce intensity she had used to protect Marcus and Lucas on the road. When the tutors grew impatient, she studied harder. When the other children whispered, she grew quieter and more focused. The triplets remained her anchor. To Marcus, Lucas, and their brother, Ira wasn't a project or a trespasser. She was the girl who had brought light back into their world. They followed her everywhere, their laughter filling the library where she studied. Ira began to apply what she was learning in her textbooks to her interactions with them, observing their development with a keen, natural insight that even the most expensive childcare experts lacked. She found that her shadow puppets were more than just a trick. They were a gateway to communication. By the end of the first year, the street girl had vanished, replaced by a scholar whose intellect was as sharp as a diamond. She had surpassed the grade levels of her age group, moving through advanced mathematics and science with a speed that left her tutors stunned. The bullying didn't stop, but its power evaporated. When a wealthy classmate attempted to mock her origins during a summer gala at the estate, Ira didn't flinch or argue. She simply looked the girl in the eyes and corrected her faulty logic regarding a geopolitical theory they were discussing, doing so with a calm, devastating precision that left the room silent. Julian, watching from the balcony, saw that his ward was no longer just a girl he had rescued. She was a force of nature he had unleashed. Ira had risen from the dust not by shedding her past, but by using it as the foundation for a brilliant, unshakable future. 10 years had passed since the dust of the estate road had stained Ira's mismatched shoes, and the riverside mansion had transformed from a daunting museum into the sanctuary where she had forged a new identity. The girl with the frayed brown jacket was gone, replaced by a woman whose presence commanded a different kind of silence, a silence of respect. Ira was now a renowned developmental specialist, a professional who had traveled the world to study the architecture of the human heart, yet she had never truly left the side of the three boys who had first called her to her purpose. The triplets, Marcus, Lucas, and Leo, were now 12 years old, standing on the precipice of a turbulent adolescence. They were no longer the identical toddlers in striped overalls. They had grown into distinct individuals, each carrying the weight of the Riverside name in their own way. But wealth, Ira had learned, was often a gilded cage that trapped shadows just as easily as it displayed gold. While Julian's empire had continued to swell, a new crisis was brewing within the very walls he had spent a decade trying to protect. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a chilling, hollow withdrawal. Leo, the most sensitive of the three, had begun to slip away into a profound, unreachable silence. It started with skipped meals and ended with him barricading himself in the darkened theater room for days, refusing to speak even to his brothers. The world's leading psychologists were summoned to the estate, arriving with leather briefcases and clinical diagnoses, yet they all retreated with the same frustrated expression. They saw a billionaire's son with an attitude problem or childhood depression, but none of them could find the key to the door Leo had locked from the inside. Julian Riverside, now graying at the temples but still wearing his charcoal gray suits like armor, found himself pacing the marble foyer once again, feeling that familiar, agonizing powerlessness. He looked at the heavy oak doors of the theater room and then at Ira, who stood by the window watching the sunset hit the ancient oak trees. The debt of honor was a silent pact between them. Julian had given her a life, but Ira had given his sons a soul. He didn't have to. He simply looked at her, and the command was in his eyes: save him.
Ira knew that this was not a problem that could be solved with the advanced theories she had presented at global conferences. This was a crisis of the spirit, an echo of the terror the boys had felt 10 years ago on the dirt road when they thought they were alone in the world. The triplets were facing a modern abandonment, one of high expectations and the cold pressure of an impending legacy. As she approached the door, she didn't bring a notepad or a prescription. She reached into the pocket of her tailored trousers and pulled out a small, familiar object she had kept all these years, a single, weathered tan straw hat, identical to the ones they had worn as babies. She realized that to bring Leo back, she would have to remind him of the girl who had stopped for them when the rest of the world kept driving. The debt was no longer about money or housing. It was about the sacred promise that no matter how dark the room became, she would be the one to find the light. The air inside the Riverside mansion had grown stagnant, thick with the clinical scent of failure that followed the departure of the latest team of specialists. Julian stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his shadow stretching long and jagged across the marble, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door, where Leo remained entombed in silence. The triplets were drifting apart like ice floes in a dark sea, and for the first time in a decade, the billionaire's estate felt like a mausoleum rather than a home. Ira did not approach the door with the heavy tread of an expert or the clatter of equipment. She moved with the same weightless, ghost-like grace that had first brought her onto this property 10 years ago. She carried only the small straw hat and a simple glass of water. She didn't knock. She leaned her forehead against the wood and began to hum. It was the same low, resonant vibration from her grandmother's shanty, a sound that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the nervous system. Inside the darkened theater, Leo sat hunched in the front row, a small figure swallowed by a plush velvet seat. He was drowning in a psychological emergency that the doctors had misdiagnosed as mere withdrawal. To Ira, it was a silent scream, a total shutdown of the heart. As the melody drifted through the cracks of the door, Leo's fingers, which had been locked in tight fists for days, began to tremble. It was a familiar anchor in a storm of adolescent pressure and the suffocating expectation of being a riverside heir. Ira slowly pushed the door open. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she sat on the floor in the aisle, casting a small shadow against the silver screen. She began to move her hands. In the dim light, the silhouettes of a bird and a rabbit appeared once more, flickering like old memories. "The world is very loud, Leo," she whispered, her voice a calm current in the dark, "and sometimes the only way to hear yourself is to stop talking. But you don't have to be alone in the quiet." The emergency wasn't a physical wound, but a fracturing of the boy's will to exist in a world that felt cold and transactional. As Ira spoke, she wove together the expertise of a world-class specialist with the raw empathy of the girl who had once had nothing. She described the dirt road, the terror of the test, and the moment she realized that his life was more precious than all the acres of the estate. Slowly the boy moved. He slid from the seat and sat on the floor alongside her. The full circle was complete when Leo finally reached out and took the weathered straw hat from her lap, clutching it as if it were a life preserver. The silence wasn't broken by a grand speech, but by a single ragged sob. He leaned his head against Ira's shoulder, and the dam finally broke. Outside in the hallway, Marcus and Lucas stood with their father, listening as the jagged sounds of their brother's grief finally transitioned into the steady rhythmic breathing of a child who had been found. Ira had saved them again. She hadn't used a scalpel or a serum, but the same ancient gift she had brought from the shacks, the ability to stand in the gap when someone is falling. She had proven that while Julian's money had built the walls, it was her heart that kept the ceiling from coming down. The crisis had passed, not because the billionaire had found a new expert, but because the girl with the mismatched shoes had never stopped watching over the road. The morning sun rose over the riverside estate with a renewed clarity, burning away the overcast gloom that had haunted the property for years. Julian Riverside stood on the wide stone terrace, a cup of coffee forgotten in his hand, as he watched the scene on the lawn below. For the first time since the boys were born, the vast green pastures didn't look like a managed asset or a display of power. They looked like a home. Marcus, Lucas, and Leo were running through the tall grass, their laughter rising in a bright, chaotic harmony that the estate's rigid rules had once tried to stifle. And in the center of it all was Ira, moving with a quiet, regal composure that anchored the boy's energy. Julian looked down at his own hands, then at the charcoal gray suit he still wore like a suit of armor. He realized with a sudden, sharp pang of humility that he had spent his entire life believing he was the architect of this family's salvation. He had told himself, for a decade, that he was the savior, the man who had plucked a starving girl from the dust and gifted her a future. But as he watched Ira sit on a stone bench and pull the 3 12-year-olds into a huddle, sharing a joke that made even the once withdrawn Leo double over with joy, the truth finally fully unmasked itself. He hadn't saved Ira. Ira had saved him. He walked down the marble steps, his shoes clicking softly on the stone, and approached the group. When Ira looked up, her dark eyes were clear and steady, devoid of the suspicion she had carried as a 13-year-old, but still possessing that same fierce, unbought integrity. Julian didn't speak as a billionaire or a boss. He spoke as a father who had finally passed his own test. He told her then that he was officially naming her the director of a new foundation, one that would turn the outskirts of the estate into a center for children who were currently living in the dust she had come from. But more than that, he told her that she was the true successor to the Riverside legacy,
not because of her mastery of his manufacturing books, but because she was the only one who knew how to manage the family's most precious resource, their humanity. "I thought I was teaching you how to live in the world of gold," Julian said, his voice thick with a rare emotion, as he looked from Ira to his 3 sons. "But all this time, you were the one teaching me how to live in the world of people. I gave you a roof, Ira, but you gave us a heartbeat." Ira stood up, smoothing the fabric of her professional attire, though her smile remained the same one she had used to calm the toddlers 10 years ago. She didn't thank him for the position or the prestige. She simply reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of equality that would have been unthinkable on that first afternoon. She had come to the estate with nothing in her pockets, but she was leaving the moment as the richest person Julian had ever known. The girl from the shacks had taught the man who had everything that compassion isn't something you can buy or manufacture. It is a gift you give away for free. As the triplets ran back to pull them both into a sprawling, messy embrace, the richest heart was no longer a metaphor. It was the reality of a family that had finally learned that the most valuable thing on 200 acres of land was the love they no longer had to tell.